Hi, welcome to episode 64 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Gabriella Timmis. Gabbi lives about 6 miles to the north of me in Manhattan, and she is the social media director for Braver Angels, one of the country's foremost organizations rebuilding bridges across the political divide. Gabbi, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing, and could you share a bit of your story?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Michael. And yeah, a bit about my story. So I came into this world the youngest of four. So I always think that birth order really informs a lot of, I came out fighting. I'm a bit of a scrapper by nature. Um, so yeah, I was raised in Michigan in I like to say a swing district in a swing state. So I was always kind of around just people with different views. My dad leans right, my mom leans left. So that certainly had, that certainly informed the way I navigated the world. But yeah, I came in the youngest of four, grew up in an Irish Catholic community, still have great friends from there. And yeah, I always had something to say. I will say that I always was hurt. I always got the feedback from teachers that Gabby was a fitting name for me. so, they always loved Gabby, stop gabbying. So that's a little bit back about my coming into this world.
Yeah. And where in Michigan were you?
So it's like Metro Detroit. It's a town called Birmingham.
Okay.
But yeah, so it's like half an hour from the city of Detroit.
Okay. And then I guess were politics always something that you were aware of growing up, or is that something that happened in college or afterwards?
Yeah, well, so maybe this is not the most heartwarming story, but I will say it's interesting because one of the first times I remember being super cognizant. Well, I'll start from here. I'll say one of my first memories is in 2001. I was 6, and my mom and I were watching the news, and George Bush came on, and she was like, "Should I vote for that guy?" And then Al Gore came on, and then she's like, "Or that guy." And I remember I said George Bush because I thought he was cuter. I don't know. That was the range of my political knowledge at 6.
Yeah.
And then I remember having conversations with her. Like, I remember being young, and I remember having conversations about abortion, and I remember I don't know. So it was always something that was definitely around.
Hmm.
Um, and one of the things that I say is, I remember growing up because my dad was more conservative. I remember growing up and we had Fox News on in the house, and then my parents got divorced, and then we always had CNN on in the house. And that was one of the big changes. That it was just what we watched on the news just suddenly changed. But yeah, both my parents are super interested in politics. Both of them are very well informed, well educated people. So they love that conversation. So honestly, half my information comes from just talking to either parent, and definitely a way for my mom and I to bond. We'll just sit at the kitchen table and we can sit for 4 hours without looking at our phones and just talk about politics for the entirety of the 4 hours. So anyway, so it's definitely always been kind of a big part of my life. And I will say my final thing is I went to an all girls Catholic high school.
Hmm.
And so in my community, my mom was the only parent that I knew who had voted for Obama, because also Mitt Romney, who's obviously the Republican candidate in 2012, was from my community. So just to say that I was always kind of, had a different opinion than my peers growing up. So I very much so, came into politics, I think, maybe ready to scrap, as I came into the world. So I was always, debating nuns about, same-sex marriage, or, just I was always kind of getting into these, deeper topics when I was just a high schooler. And yeah, so I remember my senior year is voted most opinionated because me and my history teacher would always go back and forth. He had picked posters of Nixon all over the wall, and he'd always come in doing the peace signs into his classroom, and we'd go back and forth, and he'd call me smartass. But I mean, honestly, just to say, yeah, he'd be like, "What do you want, smartass?" Every single time I had something to say. But just to say, I will say, I was so lucky that I was exposed to a variety of opinions growing up, and I was also, it never felt high stakes, and maybe that's for a variety of reasons. But it just, I was able to get into those conversations, which was, a huge privilege. So
Yeah.
that's my,
Yeah.
that's my journey to people.
Yeah. And then I guess your physical journey, how did you go from Michigan and end up in New York?
Yeah, so I went to Michigan State
Mm.
for college, and it is interesting because I wasn't, just to be honest, the most like ambitious student by any means. And I remember I was sitting at a job, I was sitting at an internship in Michigan, and I was so bored. And I was just like, gosh, if I want like a career and I really want to like, I really want to do well, like I need to do something I'm super interested in. So then I started thinking about like, what am I really interested in? Which is like media and politics. So then it really was like something like switched in me where like suddenly I was like, I got super hyper focused on wanting to work at NBC News in New York. Like it went from like not really knowing, not really carving out a path to like, okay, I'm just going to put everything I can into trying to work at NBC News in New York. Um, so that was like leading into my, I think, junior year. So then I started doing internships, at local TV stations, and just doing anything I can to like kind of get an advantage or anything, just to set myself up to work at a place like that. And certainly it was difficult to get in, but I ended up, out of college, working at NBC. So I ended up, figuring it out, which was great. So that's how
Wow.
I kind of came to New York. Yeah.
Wow. And then were you working at NBC immediately before you joined Braver Angels?
Yeah. So I was working at NBC, and I was in the education division. And so while I was there, I really got interested in the whole concept of education. I loved, I just, especially for me, not being the best student, I had ADHD, I would get kicked out of class, I was talking too much, I was always getting in trouble. So I was really interested in like educational neuroscience and like how we can really, set up schools to work with students and different learn and how students learn differently, et cetera. So I was really interested in that, and I actually ended up wanting to dive deeper into that. So while I was at NBC, I applied for grad school, for the grad school of education. So fast forward to March 2020, I found out. Well, first of all, in March, and it was like something like March 9th, 2020. So it's
Hmm.
right, when everything with
Yeah.
COVID
Something
was
else
just starting
happened
out.
around then.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was just maybe like this world event or something. And we found out that our division was getting shut down at NBC. Our education division was getting shut down. So that was, really sad and really upsetting. And then that night, as like we all went for beers and, we're just kind of mourning the loss of, our jobs. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
I got an email that I'd gotten into grad school. So it went from this like sad day to really happy day to then a couple months later, and like around May 2020, I found out that my program was going to be online for the next year. And I just, again, like knowing how I operate as a student, I was just like, I don't think that that's going to work for me. Like I just can't imagine that that's going to be the best environment for me. So I ended up turning down the offer for grad school, and then I just had a year ahead of me where I was like, okay, so what am I going to do? So I ended up moving home to Michigan, and that was right before the 2020 election. So I got into like political organizing. I was doing something specifically called deep canvassing, where it's really about connecting with like undecided voters to move their opinion. So I was working and trying to move for the opinion for Joe Biden on the ground because the 2016 election was quite tight, and Michigan was a huge state during that election. So I really wanted to do something where I could advocate for what I believed in. But I will say, those conversations and that work is really what led me into my polarization work, because as I was having those conversations with voters, I just kept hearing over and over again about how this thing called polarization was destroying their families and their friendships and their relationships. And that, to me, more than any other policy, really struck me, that I was like, okay, like this is what I want to put my energy towards. Rather than advocating for a certain side, I really want to figure out how the two sides can kind of at least communicate better. So yeah, that was my path to Braver Angels.
Wow. Yeah. No. I think like to me that was like my. I guess with the way I guess I'd been framing politics one way for so long, and then
Yeah,
when I kind of stepped back, I was like, it's having this really like nefarious impact on people. Like it's making
yeah,
them miserable. It's making them angry. It's making them suspicious. It's making them hateful and dividing families. And I was like, I can't believe that I've let it do that to me, and
yeah.
I want to at least kind of, I don't know if pull the curtain back, but just kind of try to reframe it in a different way.
No, totally. And it's, I always, when I talk about, coming to this work, I'm always like, I don't come to this work with a perfect journey behind me. I've done the thing where I've gotten into yelling matches, and I've called names and I've done, and so it's really, it's not like oh, I've always done this perfectly and look at me and look where I am now. It's like I'm still learning. And I think that's like honestly a really nice thing about working at Braver Angels is that you meet so many people who are still on their journey, and that's okay. You don't have to be perfect at something right away.
Yeah.
But I will say it is interesting, and I'll be curious if this is the same experience for you, Michael. I was talking to someone recently at Braver Angels, and he was saying, I was so upset all the time, and I was so angry and stuff like that. But putting my energy towards Braver Angels has given me a sense of calm because now I know where my position is in the storm. Like the storm's still happening. I can see the chaos and everything that's still going on, but at least I know my role in it, and I know I can do something. Maybe not solve it right away, but I'm curious for you. Have you found kind of a sense of calm since getting into this
Absolutely.
work?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that I mean, it really was Braver Angels was one of those like anchors. It was like that was the safe spot where it's just like, oh, I never thought that you could really do the mental gymnastics of seeing something from a different viewpoint, or
Hmm.
just realizing that there's something even more important here. And because I think like a lot of what I'd seen, and this is my entire life, and I'm like 52, but like
Hmm.
I think the meaning of the country has got so conflated with your personal values versus
Yeah.
like there's a broader thing. Like the United States is not about, it's not defined by the right to an abortion, or the right,
Mm.
or no abortion. Like that's not, if we frame it that way, then it's always going to be this like zero sum game. Like to me, there's got to be something more important. And I think maybe in some respects it's less satisfying because like you want
Mhm.
the substance of like, this country stands for this and this and this, but I think it really stands for the process. Like it stands for the
Mm.
process of how do we talk with each other. It stands for the compromise. It stands for the fact that there is no, to me, there's no defining truth. Like if you go to most other countries, there's some kind of like, there's hundreds or thousands of years of history. There might be
Yeah.
other cultures, but there's a very dominant culture, whether you're in France
Yeah.
or Italy or wherever. The United States is like such a dynamic country that has
Yeah.
so many different influences on it, that to say that the United States is one particular right or another particular right, you're denigrating the country. It means something more than
Yeah.
that, and it's something less sexy, but it's
Yeah.
that idea of bringing together different groups of people to make compromises and to tap into all that amazing talent and passion, whether it's a cattle rancher in Montana, or it's a tech worker in San Francisco, or if it's an actor or an actress in New York.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. First of all, I love the reframing of like it's truly about the process. I think that's really cool. And it's interesting. My boyfriend's from Ireland, and so just seeing the United States through his perspective, through an immigrant's perspective, is so fun because it's exactly what you're saying. It's like he's like, wow, it's really interesting in this country. You can bring together people of all different backgrounds, and that I think like I remember talking to David Lapp, who's one of the co-founders of Brave Angels, and he made the point that he was like, my dream for Brave Angels is that it can really create spaces where we have the lawyer and the tech guy and the cattle rancher and the hairdresser, and everyone's there and everyone's opinion matters equally, and we can all kind of listen to each other. So it really is, I think you're so spot on with that. It really is about just like the process. And so unfortunately, and I think you're right, because unfortunately we focus so much on the issues, which are obviously important, but we kind of take for granted that the process is really the thing that's, I think, gotten broke, is most broken right now, and is the thing that we can kind of work on healing that aspect of it. Um, so no,
Yeah, yeah.
that's really interesting.
And I think that, to the way I see it is that where this, I think if you look at history, there's always problems. So in some
Hmm.
respects, I don't think that there's any reason to necessarily be like, oh my god, this is the worst ever, because there's always been, like, the 60s were
Yeah.
tumultuous, the Great
Yeah.
Depression was very tumultuous, World War II, like you can go back to the turn of the last century, they were worried about anarchists. Like there's always
Yeah.
problems. This is our burden for our generation,
Yeah.
and I don't think that it makes us any worse or any better. I think it's just more like we have to be more pragmatic about it, to be like, look, this is what's been happening. And I think that we love to talk to you more about like the media, because I think, like, to me, I think the way I look at it is like the media that dominates right now, in my
Hmm.
perception, there's lots of individuals doing good things, but I think
Hmm.
that the structure of it is broken. I think the incentives
Hmm.
are misaligned with what we want, and I don't yet know, like, I guess what how to fix that, how to cope with it.
Mhm.
But I just think that that's, to me, like, what's been probably the most liberating thing, other than like connecting with Braver Angels, was just not watching the news anymore and not reading
Mhm.
the New York Times. And I certainly don't necessarily know a lot of the specifics going on anymore. I can still see what's going on with like an Instagram post, as far
Yeah.
as just like, oh, this happened, but I don't get into the details of it, because I kind of feel like the news has become more of like this mouthpiece for one side or the other,
Yeah.
versus providing its own independent viewpoint. And like, I
Yeah.
find it like unsatisfying. Like, you'll read the New York Times and you'll never read something that would say anything about like Donald Trump did this good. Like, they would
Mm.
never ever say Donald Trump did this well. And that's something like,
Yeah.
oh, he did what we wanted him to do, but hey, he had a positive impact
Mhm.
because of this or this. And just like you wouldn't see Fox News saying, hey, Joe Biden has done this well. You're not going to
Mhm.
see that, because they're going to lose readers, they're going to lose viewers, right?
Mhm.
So they just never do that. So to me, it's like you're automatically, like, a fair you're not getting a healthy representation of the world. And even to just go from one side to the other side, is like kind of allowing yourself to be kind of manipulated by the angry people on the left or the angry people on the right. So I don't find it
Mhm.
necessarily satisfying that, oh, okay, well, I just have to read more sources of media because I don't have the time. And what that just means, I get to be triggered from lots of different angles.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the media is so interesting because obviously we often talk about like the media, the people in the media, and it's hard because to your point, like there are thousands of people, like there's local media. The media is such a big, umbrella. It's like talking about people who work in healthcare or something, it's like such a
Yeah.
large industry. And I think I will say like at Brave Angels events, we hear all the time about people, kind of bemoaning the media. And I totally, totally resonate and I understand why. The thing that I always kind of go back to is like, it's almost scarier to me because I think a lot of people are like, you know, there's all these nefarious things happening and it's bad and blah blah blah. And I'm like, I think it's actually scarier because I think it's just a lot of people who don't know how to fix this problem. So they're just gonna keep doing what they've always done. And it's not like they have bad intentions or that they mean to necessarily create all the division they're creating. They just are. And it's kind of just this like monster that's come, taken on a life of itself. And it is very interesting. And to your point, it's a really hard problem to solve. So even for example, like Chris Licht from CNN, who's a former president of CNN, he was just recently let go, but one of his big priorities coming into CNN was like, I want CNN to be the source of absolute truth. I want it to be the place that people can trust, that, you turn on CNN and like, you're not getting that bias, that you can say, here's what, the right did well and here's what the left did well and vice versa, here's what they did poorly and here's what they did poorly. But it was very interesting. There's this whole like 15,000 word piece from Tim Alberta, who's a great journalist, but he wrote this whole profile on Chris Lichten about his whole journey through it. And it was very interesting because polarization, the aspect of polarization in media is a really hard problem to solve. And, there are people like Amanda Ripley, like Joy Mayer, like Monica Guzman that are starting to work on it. And I think even they would say, as people who are really focused on the issue, would say it's really hard to solve. So that's the thing. Like my biggest thing when I read that profile of Chris Licht was like, why did he not call the big players in polarization and say, what do I do? This is a beast of an issue. He might know how to create good television, or he might have been, the showrunner for Stephen Colbert and knew how to get great ratings in that arena. But addressing polarization through media is a beast of its own, and it's a really complicated one to solve. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I'm curious to see how that goes long term because it's really really hard. And to your point, there's also the financial incentives, and there's all these other things you're trying to and who are the people watching cable news every night? Oftentimes, the most partisan and polarized people. So people like you and like myself who are kind of like you know taking a step back and kind of seeing the political minefield for what it is,
Yeah.
we might not be inclined to turn on cable news. So then, even if they are trying to be the absolute truth source, so it's so complicated.
Yeah, and then their audience becomes self-fulfilling, that their audience is going to be more hyper partisan, more sensitive, and
Yeah,
then like, well, we don't want to lose those viewers because we've already lost others, so we have
totally.
to do so. Yeah, so it's the two things that I was thinking of recently is like, there's like two ingrained parts of the media that I think cause a lot of the problems. And it's one, it's like the sensationalization, like the yellow journalism, which has been
Yeah.
happening since the days of like Hearst and Pulitzer. But the other
Yeah.
part is like this idea of being like the watchdog. You know what I mean? Like the kind of like
Yeah.
to finding the problems, because like, if I've been trying for my organization, for American Tributaries, I've been trying to get some journalists to be interested in talking with us and hearing about what we're doing. And if you look at the different departments that a lot of that a lot of press organizations are organized by, there's nothing about depolarization, right?
Yeah.
And it's all, and if you read the articles, every one of them is about kind of like and I don't mean this to be necessarily pejorative, but like that's kind of like gotcha journalism. Like, let's find the problems, right?
Yeah.
And there's there's something very unsatisfying about any source of things is always just trying to find problems. Like,
Hmm.
and on the other hand, I get the idea that you don't actually want to have journalists that are just out kind of parroting positive talking points, but there's something about just like this idea of just tearing things down and just finding problems, because once an organization gets big enough, you're always going to find problems,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And one
Totally.
of the things I was thinking about was like, this idea of like the bigger the government becomes, the more helpless any individual is in dealing with
Mm.
the government. So then you always want more voices. So then the media kind of satisfies that desire to get other voices and get attention on problems with the government, because the media will cast a light and now more people know about it, but it doesn't really fix anything. And I think
Yeah.
that's, to me, that watchdog mentality is this kind of like, is the problem really that people just want solutions and the government has been promising us solutions for so long, but it's
Yeah.
actually far too big to do a lot of the problem solving that we need.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's much easier just to talk about the problems versus than actually the solutions, which obviously there are organizations like Solutions Journalism who try to, focus on, what we can actually do about all our issues. But it
Yeah.
is interesting because one thing I'm thinking about is like, by because I mean, what is, I guess, there is a big question of what is the actual purpose of the media? Is it to be that watchdog figure? Is it to be just a source to give you all of the information? Because if we're only hearing about the problems and never the solutions, then we're not getting a full, scope of the issue. We're only hearing about half of it, and then people are left, to your point, helpless. And I think
Right.
polarization is such a good one, like such a good example of that. I remember when I was in grad school, like I really, one of my thoughts was like maybe I could focus on polarization as like a beat, like a reporter focuses
Yeah.
on education or any other issue. Um, and it was interesting because I talked to a few people about it, and people were kind of confused and were like, "What? Like, what does that actually look like?" And when I started at Braver Angels, I actually started as a field reporter, where I was writing about, what was actually being done on the ground. Um, and those stories are just as true and accurate as any of the bad ones.
Right.
It is a story like any other story. I
Right.
don't think that the fact that there's a positive angle to it makes it inherently less worthy. I
Right.
think, in fact, we need those stories.
Yeah, like we need that, and you don't get that. Like if
Yeah.
you only hear about the conflict and you don't hear, like, for me, I find it's surprising how often comes up where people are like, yeah, like I encountered a guy wearing a Trump hat, but they were really nice, or like they were really helpful, or like I have a friend who was, him and his husband were, had to do some tear down on their property, and he's talking about his neighbors who were all like politically different, very different than them, that just kind of
Yeah.
came over and helped them tear it down and became a big party. And like it's non-issue, but you don't hear about those, and nor should you necessarily hear it like as like a celebration of something that's so unique. Like it's almost more like it's more every day, and
Yeah.
but we don't get that. You only get the negative and the conflict. And in some respects I equate it to like school. Like if you think about it, like when you're in school, the kids who are working together don't get the attention. It's like when there's a fight in the back, then all of a
Yeah.
sudden everybody's out there cheering. And I mean,
Yeah.
I guess that's human nature, but like aren't we able to evolve away from that? And
Yeah, no, totally. It's interesting because I was just saying this something the other day. It's like you don't hear like, breaking news. The subway is working efficiently. You know what I mean? Like that's never like, you never hear about that stuff. And it is interesting. Like it's like I often think like again, I think in the whole polarization and politics question, like we focus so much on the issues and this and that, but I think a lot about the personality aspect and like to your point, like the human evolution aspect of like again, just for me personally, like a lot of my own journey and trying to get like depolarized um has been like something that's combined, yeah, like healing and mental health and all, those things that maybe sound a little woo woo and like, isn't as like cutting edge as like the big political issues, but it's what's given me peace, and it's what's been given me permission and ability to like listen to other views, and like even if they upset me, like manage my emotions and stuff like that. Like it's these are kind of it's interesting. So it's like, we never hear about that in the political realm, but I actually think that has a lot to do with, our issues. Like even I remember Amanda Ripley wrote an article, I think for the Washington Post. I think it was something along the lines of like, I'm a journalist and I don't read the news or something like that. And she was kind of explaining why. And one of the things she had to say was like, journalists are like not okay. Like they're underpaid, they're overworked, their hours aren't great, they're constantly antagonized. And that's not to, shed tears for journalists. Like, in many ways they have a very cushy setup, but just to say like, if you're constantly, to your point, like everything's a 10 or 11 or a 12 and you're just constantly stimulated, how can you really be in the headspace to write clear-minded journalism and really write the entire story of the problem, the solution, everything that's going on? So it is interesting. I just feel like sometimes that piece of the conversation, that human evolution, can we better ourselves, gets kind of overlooked because there's all these other sexier, clickbait headlines going on.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we can. I mean, and I know that like there's definitely still racism, and there are problems, but like
For
we've
sure.
evolved a lot from 2 generations ago, 3, 4. I mean, like we've definitely are able to evolve. Like I don't
Yeah.
think like the racism that we talk about now is very different than the racism that was being confronted 100 years
Mm.
ago or 50 years ago. So I think that the idea of being able to evolve is possible. And in some respect,
Mhm.
like when we're talking about this stuff, I think there's also a tendency for people to look for solutions from other people. Like
Mm.
Facebook needs to fix their algorithm,
Yeah.
or NBC needs to be doing better journalism, or
Yeah.
but like really, it's also about us. Like Facebook,
Yeah.
all those we don't have to repost those articles on Facebook that we see that make us upset, or those like rumors or the gossip we see. We don't need to always rant on Facebook. Like we have to take, I
Yeah.
think, a little responsibility for ourselves about what we're contributing to the media out there, all the different kinds.
Totally. And it's interesting because I've heard this like kind of conversation in the depolarization bridging community, which is like, we can't just be about like, let's all just come together. Like, we have to also identify the external threats. And like, just because that's how human brains work sometimes, is you have to almost identify like, what are we working against as well? We know what we're working for, but like, what are we trying to, position ourselves against? But for me, I'm like, I think it's our own worst instincts. I think it's not necessarily a human being or an institution. And certainly like, institutional issues are deep and problematic, and it's hard to just be one individual changing when, cultural and institutional norms are still, very toxic and difficult to navigate. But just to say, like, I'm like, if I think there's any like thing to fight in all of this, is yourself and the temptation to, you know, yell at people and call names and stuff like that. And it's just about like regulating, trying to just take
Yeah.
accountability for your own reaction to the world.
Right.
Um,
And also maybe understand, like, you have to reframe, I think, what we're doing. Like, in one respect, this idea of like, even if you're on Facebook, like understanding that we're all like the way a generation ago, like my brother and I are politically, I mean, I think different, although I'd like to think that we're able to kind of align on more things if we just talked. But like,
mhm,
you know, whatever would happen, like we would see each other for family events or whatever, right? So you just see each
mhm.
other, and you talk about family, kids, whatever, the Mets. Like, we'll just talk about certain things,
Yeah,
and you never really had time to talk about politics. If you did, you maybe just dabbled in it, but it wasn't a big deal. But
yeah,
and then you wouldn't see each other for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and then you get together again, and it's the same kind of themes that are less controversial, more like unifying. But
yeah,
what Facebook does is all of a sudden it lets you stay connected, and now like
mm,
they're seeing and eavesdropping on all of your
yeah,
conversations that matter to you back in your community, and you're eavesdropping in on their conversations and their concerns, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my god, we're more different than I thought. But you were always
yeah,
different. It's just you never were exposed to it or immersed in it, and now you are. And
mhm,
we have to also learn that, yeah, most people are different. Like, I think that, to me, the grounding reference point that I always take is like, look, my wife and I, we've been together for 24 years, and there's lots of things that we disagree on. We don't, but you don't always
Yeah.
bring it up either. You don't say, hi, let me take the
Yeah.
most contentious thing we have and let's always talk about that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if and are my kids, like, we share DNA, and like all the kids, they have the same DNA from each of them, and they're all very different. So this
Mhm.
idea that people are supposed to be the same is, I mean, or people need to become the same is a preposterous mindset to have.
Mhm.
So and I think that goes to the idea of being more forgiving about different viewpoints and opinions. I mean, there are bad outcomes to things and there is evil out there, but a lot of the differences we see are not, to believe that all the differences out there are rooted in evil is to have a very cynical view on the world and human beings.
Totally, and I also think that, like, I think we overemphasize how attached people are actually to the things that they say. Even again, like through Braver Angels, like we've seen that where it's like, you get into these like different workshops or conversations, and it's like, why do you believe X? Why are you pro-choice? Why are you pro-gun or why whatever? And you realize that, like, a lot of people haven't given that much thought to their beliefs, and that's part of the issue with polarization is that, like, we're getting if you know what someone where they land on in the environment, you probably know where they land on abortion, you probably know where they land on taxes, like, these things that might not seem inherently related, but it's almost like the views are getting consolidated, but to the point of, like, we just see these people as evil or bad because of like one specific policy issue. Sometimes people like are not that actually connected to what they have to say. Like there's a person in my life who was posting on Facebook about the vaccine and how much she was against it, and like I mean, some stuff to the point that I was like, okay, like she was saying that she thought it was a microchip, and Anthony Fauci was trying to microchip people, whatever. And then she was one of the first people I knew who got vaccinated. And it's like people are just funny fish. Like people are just funny in the way they navigate the world. That they might say, "This is my deepest conviction to the world," and then they might act in a complete different way, behind closed doors. And that's just humans are complex. So it's even like when I see on the news, you know, these like QAnon people are blah blah blah. I know people in my life who have fallen into the QAnon trap, which is how I'd frame it. And they're not bad people. And guess what? Sometimes 6 months later, they're like, "That was crazy. I don't know what was going on there." It's not like they're like these evil, irredeemable, like can never come back to society people. That's kind of how we treat different people with different views or different perspectives sometimes. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and and it was there was some television reporting about two Braver Angels members that were,
Mhm.
one was a Biden's voter, the other was a Trump, QAnon believing, like, Trump voter, and it was, I think the more you see those kind of like those reconciliations between people, or those abilities to kind of navigate disagreement, the better it is.
Mhm.
And in some respect, I think it's very healthy for us to like learn how to deal with disagreement, because in the past, I mean, it is, we usually only deal with disagreement, or we avoid disagreement within our small communities. Now the human
Yeah.
mind is being challenged with thousands and millions of different viewpoints, and I
Yeah.
think in many respects I'd say, you know what, yeah, this is hard to do, and I think that it really is Braver Angels and other organizations like that, like, like
Mhm.
Bridge USA, Starts With Us, and so many
Mhm.
others that are trying to say, hey, look, let's get back to this. Let's think about what unites us, and let's learn how to cope with
Mhm.
disagreement. And
Mhm.
I think it's a healthful next step in our evolution as a society.
Definitely. There's just the being able to physically tolerate disagreement. And then there's also, one thing that was coming to mind was like, Monica Guzman says this thing about, the conversation about what is true is not the only conversation worth having. There's also the conversation about what is meaningful, which I think is a really great kind of reframing and how we have conversations, because we're always like, well, your facts disagree with my facts, so we can't even start anywhere. But even like thinking about people in my life who have fallen into QAnon or like have started to believe some of that stuff. Well, okay, why? What was the underlying feeling? What was informing that, perspective? Well, part of it was fear. Part of it was instability, which is really legitimate. They look at something like what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, and they say, that could have been that was a conspiracy theory a couple years ago, and look, that was true. So why couldn't this be true? And
Right.
there's you have to like give people like space to be like, no, that makes sense. Like I understand the feeling that is informing that perspective, but you have to be able to like get over that initial perspective regardless of what it is. So yeah, it's just allowing people to be complex, because we're all we're
Yeah,
all very
yeah.
complicated.
Well, there's one of, I mean, I know Monica's her real the strength of her, the thrust of her argument is about curiosity, and I
Yeah,
think that when you encounter people that you disagree with, I think that there can be like a condescending curiosity, which is like, oh, like,
yeah,
why do you think that? Like, obviously, I think there needs to be more an open minded curiosity, just like kind of like work to get to understand the person, because even like with like, the vaccine, like on the one hand, like, you might say, okay, vaccine, of course it's fine. Like, why do you not trust the pharmaceutical companies? And then you'd be like, well, how about the opioid epidemic? Like,
yeah,
if your frame of reference is a community or a demographic that's been ravaged by by heroin,
yeah.
then, and that came from pharmaceutical companies, then of course you're going to be more questioning of the intentions of a pharmaceutical company, especially if you're not in a densely populated area where where the virus isn't necessarily as threatening.
Hmm.
You're going to look at things differently. And I think Monica even wrote in her book about just like sometimes it's more about how people, like, it's more how people prioritize things. It's not that they don't
Hmm.
value it, it's just that it's
Yeah.
in a different hierarchy, which is another thing. Like, how can you expect everybody to have the same prioritization of all these different issues?
Yeah, yeah, which is interesting, because again, like, that part of like that like reminds me of, like, I just think about like where I was saying earlier with like personality can play into politics. Like, I think there are a lot of people who are confused, for example, how anyone could go from liberal to conservative or conservative to liberal. But I even think about like someone like Joe Rogan, for example. He to me, and I don't obviously know him well, I've listened to some of his podcasts, but he to me comes across to me as someone who is inherently skeptical of authority for whatever reason. Who knows? That's just, to me, that feels like that's his bent. So in the early 2000s, when it felt like the conservative, Republican Party post 9/11 were kind of the big government, big brother, I could see why he was like, ooh, I don't like that. And then, come to today, um, when he feels like maybe like Democrats have more power and they're the ones who are getting more involved in people's day-to-day lives, I could see how he's like, ooh, I don't like that. Like, similarly, it's interesting because, like, my mom, I think about as someone who went from conservative to liberal. She kind of had the opposite trajectory, but she's someone who is a rule follower by nature. She likes to color within the lines. So I think, she used to see the Republicans as like the party of, order and conduct and stuff like that. And then she kind of switched and feels like the Democrats are more that way. And just to say, like, again, the complexity of it, and the gift of curiosity is really trying to figure out what are beneath those views, beneath the changes, and all of that. So it is interesting, because I'm actually curious about this for you. I was with in a group of people, and there was someone who was like, I just genuinely have a hard time being curious, when I hear something I disagree with. And for me, one of my tools that I use, I guess, and this kind of comes from, I think, a media perspective, is like, I want to get to the bottom of the story. I want to know what people think. I'm just inherently nosy, if anything.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so, that's part of it for me, where I'm always like, if I hear something that I disagree with or I think is, crazy or whatever, like when I was doing deep canvassing, I remember talking to a woman on the phone who was like, I will never vote for a woman for president. That was her main thing against Biden, that, Kamala Harris was his vice president.
Hmm, hmm.
And instead of being like upset or offended by that, I was like, that's just interesting that there's someone in the
Yeah.
United States that feels that way. And like, I'm certain she's not the only one. So it's just, for me, the curiosity sometimes is informed by that wanting to get the full story. I'm curious, what is your kind of curiosity informed by?
Well, I think that the turning point for me in terms of being able to like engage the things with more curiosity was, I think, trying to be less scared. And I think, to
Mm,
me, like, the more you put your toe in the water, the more you put yourself out there, the
yeah.
more you realize that. And I think this is, this goes back to the media, and it goes back to politicians, that
Hmm.
they feed us stories that are like the sensationalized, or they feed us the
Mm,
extremes. So you become more curious. So if you're scared, of course you're not going to be curious. But I
hmm.
think that what I would say to anybody is like, look, there's always the chance of something bad happen. And in some
Hmm.
respects, I'm not going to blame the media. I mean, the media is reporting the things that are newsworthy, the things that are actually the anomalies. Like, they're reporting the
Hmm.
things that are not usual, right?
Hmm.
But I think the more you try to engage other things that are outside of your purview or your comfort zone, the more empowering it is to continue to become more and
Totally.
more curious.
No,
Um,
that's cool. I was just thinking because, I one of the most helpful piece of life advice I've ever gotten was that action is the antidote to anxiety. And I think it's very natural. And I know for myself, like if something is stressing me out, I'm just gonna like avoid it, you know? So it's like, oh, I haven't responded to this person. I'm just scared. I just like I need to avoid, avoid, avoid. But the way to actually soothe that anxiety and build like internal resilience is to do the things that scare you. So to your point, like the only way to kind of reduce your fear is to go move toward it, you know, not away from it. And I think that's part of our problem right now is that we're freaked out by each other and then we move away from each other and we turn our backs on each other and then you know my friend and I always call it like that whatever we're avoiding in our lives we call it the monsters like
Uh-huh.
breathing down our necks, but like that's what our like fellow Americans are that we you know disagree with politically. There's suddenly these monsters that like if you just turned around and actually looked at them, oh okay, it's not this big scary thing, it's just other you know it's this person that I can maybe even understand why they think that way.
Right.
You know, so for example, like I remember we had a workshop on trustworthy elections, and there was a woman who came in, and she was very religious, very informed by her faith, came in and really wanted us to do a prayer before the workshop, and was talking about how she thinks the you know the root of our political situation is a you know loss of faith in the country and stuff like that. And she was a red in that group, and she ended up getting paired off with the blue. And I talked to the blue after I was interviewing people for a piece I was writing, and he was like, you know, I asked her, I told her, I'm a liberal and I'm an atheist. Can you believe that I'm a good person? And she said, of course I can. Like, you know, of course I can totally see that you're a good person. And I remember the guy telling me, he was like, it really made me want to cry that like he confronted the thing that he was like, you know, if we were on the internet, we would have been going back and forth all day and she would have
Right.
been this terrible monster. But then she saw her, they had eye contact. He could ask her the question that was on his mind. And, you know, all of his fears just kind of went away because he actually got the reality. So that's why we have to give people the real story because it's a lot less scary than we think it is.
Yeah, yeah. So what I mean was as the social media director for Braver Angels, like where do you see like I guess the what I mean what you're doing? Where do you see how social media can do good, and how, like do you have any ideas for like the future of
Mm.
the media platform for social media for Braver Angels itself?
Social media is really really hard because it's the opposite of really what we try to do in River Angels, where we have face to face, structured, moderated conversations, which sounds like even saying it sounds like this hyper controlled environment, but I think it's actually the opposite in that like the structure gives people permission to kind of just like say what's on their mind in a way that is actually true to how they feel. Where like I keep going back to Monica because I just admire so much about her, but she calls the internet a non-place where we turn into non-people, which is I think you can just see that in social media comments all the time, where these people are just constantly, you know, activating, stimulating. And I remember hearing this podcast with this other man, Louis Majika, who's a somatic therapist, and he was talking about even the very act of social media. Oftentimes, you're sedentary when you're engaging with it. You know, you're sitting down or you're standing still, and so where you know when I'm talking right now, I have hand gestures, and then my voice is going up, and that you know,
Yeah,
there's all these different ways to kind of express yourself. But when you're just sitting down and you're just typing, all the expression go is just in the words. So it you know things get so much more heightened
mm,
because you're just kind of putting all that energy to whatever you're saying in that moment.
yeah,
Versus you know letting it kind of come out in these other different ways, which I just thought was interesting. So just to say with social media itself, it's really 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 difficult. Definitely something I'm still thinking about all the time. I don't know the best way to navigate you know conversations on social media. I have met some people who've been able to accomplish to some degree you know productive political conversations. Bridging Minds is one that comes to mind. It's a Facebook group, and again it's moderated, it's structured, like you know there's a set of rules and how to engage with one another. And I think for a lot of people like that it's a private Facebook group, but I think that's been you know really beneficial for people. But it's you know when people are just left to their own devices and it's just you're commenting back and forth on this public social media post, I just that's the thing I kind of struggle with. How do we really navigate that? That to me is still a big question mark. As for Brave Rangers itself, and you know, one of my big things is like I'm always trying to think about like how can we make our work relevant to people? How can we really show people that this isn't just a kumbaya, let's all sit together and sing songs. This is like immediately applicable to your life. Like you can really use these tools, and you can get better for it. So I think one thing that you know I'm thinking of generally is you know how can we tell those stories of people who, for example, we had like an impact forum where people can kind of share their experiences with Brave Angels and how it helped them. And there was a woman who wrote in, and she was a Black woman who comes from a more liberal family, and she had children from a previous marriage, and she was marrying a white man who comes from a Trump supporting family, and he had children from previous marriages, and they were able to use Braver Angels tools and tactics to like bring their families together. And like, isn't that what this is all about?
Yeah, right. And that's what
So
we need to hear about.
exactly. So trying to work that way into our social media, I think, will be a big priority. We're working on trying to find more storytelling in our website. So I'm hoping that once we get that set up with our website, that'll be able to inform our social media, and hopefully people will see those stories, because I think they're so important.
Yeah. The the I think in some respect though, it's also like I know the Brave Angels focuses on like red and blue, but like I think there's also just the idea that the reason why to me is like F. Scott Fitzgerald had this great quote that like the mark of a first-rate mind is the ability to hold two opposing thoughts in your mind at the
Mm,
same time and still be able to function. And I think
hmm.
that it's not just in the political realm; like it's in
Totally.
every different realm. It's in a parent dealing with your child, right? There's two
Hmm.
totally different perspectives on things, and
Hmm.
yet you've got to be able to try to like step into their shoes and think about the world from their viewpoint. So I think, in some respect, the Brave Angels is talking about politics, but it's really just talking about humanity and talking about how to deal with people. Because I wrote an article once about like the right to abortion, and just
Hmm.
personally, I support the right, and I'm open to disagreement. That's not why I'm talking about this, but I wrote about it, and I said like the problem with what's happened is that the supporters of the right to abortion put too many eggs in the basket of the Supreme Court. Like,
Mm,
and what they should have done is focus more on like kind of grassroots, continuing to
yeah,
kind of like just gain support, and whether it means compromising a little bit or being a little flexible or being more patient or changing your tone, but not rely on having five Supreme Court justices to uphold the right, because too much
totally.
of it has all been about Roe v. Wade, right? And so my criticism was like, I support the right, like when you put that out there, but the
Yeah,
way the right has been protected was a failure, right? That
yeah,
and that got responses from people, and not a lot, but like people were like, well, what are you talking about? You're telling me I got to compromise. You're criticizing. I'm like, no, did you read the whole thing? Like, yeah, so I think
yeah,
it's even people within your own side. Like, you have to be willing to listen to different viewpoints from people that
yeah,
agree with you. Like, I literally, like,
yeah,
I'm on the same side. I'm on the same side of the issue, but you won't even consider a argument about the tactics used to protect the right. So
totally.
I think
It's
that's part of it, is like even just to be able to have a healthy expression of your side's viewpoint, you got to be able to have open discussions.
Totally. It's interesting. I took a class with this professor, Ron Heifetz, who talks a lot about this stuff. And he really is about like equipping people. His whole course is on like leadership. And his definition of leadership is disappointing people at the rate they can stand. And so he often talks about is like, you're often the people you're often disappointing are your own side, people on your own side. That's a big part of leadership, is like letting people down gently of like, I disagree with you in these ways. But it's interesting because another thing that came to mind was there's a book, I believe it's called How Change Happens by Leslie Crutchfield. And she really makes this point about grassroots, about like, that's where every successful movement, whether it's the NRA or same sex marriage or regardless, really started with changing minds at the grassroots level. It can't really come from the top down. And
Yeah,
I think to your point, like you were saying earlier, we're like, this needs to change, this, we need regulation on this, or we need change on that, or Supreme Court needs to do this. But, we can't put our eggs in those baskets. We really have to start at the grassroots, and we have to be, really kind of based in that. And actually, when I was working at NBC, that was definitely something that came to mind, that I was like, I understand what's happening in the news, like at a very macro level, but I don't understand how anyone feels about it. And so that's when I had the opportunity to do deep canvassing. That was like very grassroots. I was calling up people, just talking to individuals all day on the phone. And, that is where I think is where the movement happens, and it's
yeah,
sometimes it's not the sexiest. It's not, it's not the place with the biggest budget, but the thing that I always say about Brave Rangers, and the thing I really respect about it, is our grassroots, organization. You can't buy the grassroots. You can buy social media followers. You can
yeah.
buy a spot on TV. You can buy a lot. You can't buy grassroots. So
Right.
that's where it has to be
Right,
invested.
you can buy it. You can buy a follower. You can buy
Yeah.
some champion. You can contract with somebody, but to get people to actually give you their support. Their
Yeah.
hearts is a lot
Yeah.
more difficult. Yeah, no, it's the and I think the other part, and I think this, I don't know if it's like as a society we get bigger and bigger, and you have to become more focused on things to get by. And I think, like, in at least in the New York City, like, corporate world, like, you really have to. It's not, you can't be a generalist lawyer. You have to pick a specialty and then a
Mm.
subspecialty. A doctor's the same way. You don't be a generalist doctor. You got to find a niche.
Yeah.
I think that, in many respects, a lot of people, like, it's really hard. Like, like, there are lots of people where the people work 6 days a week. Like, there are couples where, like, they don't even see each other, right? There's a lot of people just
Mhm.
scraping to get by.
Yeah.
So they don't have the bandwidth to really even be involved at a grassroots level. And that's where I see,
Yeah.
like, the politicians will, and this is, I wrote an article about this, but referring, like, to the glitter of democracy. But, like, basically,
Mm.
if you look at all the things that politicians do, they always offer easy solutions. They'll and
Mhm.
it's you're never to blame, so they're burdenless and they're blameless. Like, I'm going to do this, and you are not to blame. All these problems that they're not your fault, right? And the
Yeah.
solutions are not going to burden you; they're going to burden
Yeah.
other people. And this is gonna be really easy, like student loan forgiveness or something. Like, that's like the to
Yeah.
me, like, just I'm like, we're gonna fix this by just forgiving student loans. That's not like that is not the solution to soaring tuition rates in college. It's a lot more
Yeah.
complicated than that, but we don't get that. That's not a good soundbite. So the politicians feed you those simple solutions, but I don't think
Mhm.
people have the bandwidth. I mean, it's great that Bay Area was able to succeed as a grassroots organization, because you can
Mhm.
see how hard it is for people to have the bandwidth to do anything. And then I see why people are just eager to almost just hear a politician tell them simple solutions, because I don't have the
Totally.
bandwidth to do it. So just make it go away, please, and don't trouble me, because I don't need the change.
Totally. And you're so right about that, because a big part of our culture is like our Brave Angels culture is like volunteerism, is getting people engaged. And yeah, like, who has time for that? Like, something, yeah, a dad with 3 kids, like, can't get engaged to that level every day. So that's actually just like one thing as an organization we're definitely thinking about. We have different groups internally, like one of them being We the People's Project, which really is focused on elevating the voices of everyday Americans, and thinking about, like, for someone who's an arborist, like, how can we make it easy for that person to get involved? How can we also just show them, like, you don't have to devote 5 hours a week. You don't have to give 1 hour a week. You can do these small different things and really, try to get people involved through that way. But you're totally right, where it's like what we're up against is easy solutions and this easy anger and easy blame, and the
Yeah,
work of change and evolution is hard, and it's long, and it's not sexy, and there's trade-offs, and there's all these, you're acknowledging the complexity up front, where I think you're right. Oftentimes politicians have the benefit of being able to put together really beautiful marketing
yeah,
campaign for
yeah, yeah.
themselves.
Yeah, and I think, to me, one of the things that when I think about what I hear politicians say, and I've said this before, and I might become like a broken record about it, but it's like,
Mm,
we all live in the working. Like, if you anybody who's worked knows how hard it is to get a project done, even on a
yeah.
small little scale. So
Yeah.
this idea that, oh, the government is going to fix something, you're talking about
Yeah.
this apparatus that is so much more complicated, and that's got tens of thousands of people, and, like, all the stuff, and you think that that's the select. I mean, to me, the government should be considered like maybe part of the solution, but there's a lot more we can do on the ground to kind of also make things happen. But I think that's the idea of,
Mhm.
like, okay, so that means that I got to do something. That's hard to do, is to take it.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
I think that's to me, the sobering reality is just understand that it's a huge organization that you're asking to just kind of pivot every 4 years based on who the president is, to just
Yeah.
fix something. That's just,
Yeah.
it's not, if that's where you can put your eggs in the basket of, like, bringing about change in the society, like, you're going to be very disappointed.
Yeah. It was interesting because one thing that's coming to mind, was that, again, going back to that class I took with her on hype, it's like, um, in the first there's like 2 halves of it, but the first half, or a full semester, every day you come to class, the professor doesn't tell you what to do, and you and your classmates are just staring at each other, and you have to try to figure out, like, what to do, and you're all trying to, like, work toward this goal of figuring out, like, what are we supposed to do, and it's like a very real time, like, display of, like, how human beings are really hard to, like, move in any direction, because I say this and then that person says that, and it's just like, and then everyone gets frustrated because we're not going anywhere, and it was just a very interesting portrayal of that. But In terms of the actual work of like depolarization, I remember one thing that really stuck with me, that Liz Joyner from Village Square has said, is that this work that we do is both mandatory and impossible, which is actually like a very good framing on it, because it's like, does it feel impossible? Because it is, it's we're up against every cultural wind, and all the institutions and the big money, and like we're just working against all the forces, and but that doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. I think it's completely worth doing for both our country and also just us as individuals. I think it's tremendously important.
Yeah, well, it's important, man, and also, I mean, I can say, like, personally, like, you, Braver Angels, and I'm not like, I'm a member, but I'm not. I haven't. I'm not very active with a lot of the activities, but
Mhm.
I've taken the Braver Angels spirit, and is
Mhm.
what connected me with, Eric Ireland, the
Mhm.
Braver Angels member in South Carolina, and he is the
Mhm.
one who kind of like just really was like, that was like the last piece for me, the linchpin, and like being, wait a second, like I've talked to a Republican in South Carolina, and we had so much in common, and we had such, and it
Mm.
was such a healthy conversation, and he was my first guest on this podcast, and
Mm.
he's
That's awesome.
he's an officer in American Tributaries, which is trying to do like domestic travel also. Like, he's been so had made such a big difference, and he's the one who really led to this podcast and my efforts to
Yeah.
promote travel. So I think you never know, and I'm not saying I've actually done anything yet, but I can say that I've made all these connections with people that I never would have made before, because he's the one who like sparked that curiosity, and I wouldn't have
Yeah.
met him without Braver Angels. So I
But you
hope that I'm sure you're having that impact on like all the thousands of members in their own
But
way.
no, I mean, you have done so much, and that's the cool thing, is that like, even if like, it doesn't matter how you participate, it's the fact that you found what you're good at, podcasting, planning these trips. Like, you have found your skill set and you've channeled it into the broader goal of Braver Angels. So that's huge. I mean, the fact that like we were even able, to spark that inspiration and connect you with that person. I mean, that is what we want people doing. Engaging with Braver Angels doesn't have to always be going to every workshop or starting an alliance or whatever. And like, that's great. And we're so, so, so indebted really to our volunteers on the ground who do that work, because that is what our work is really driven by. But that being said, as we say, like, this is bigger than one organization, right? Like, Brave Rangers, we're really trying to create a movement, to be honest. And one organization can't do that. We need people like you who, you're a member of Brave Angels, love that, but you find your place in the world and where you can contribute. And I think that's the lesson for anyone, is like, what are you good at? What do you love to do? For example, we have this Braver Network, which is when we bring together organizations, whether it's a church or a company or whatever, who are buying into the message and mission of Brave Angels. And one of the organizations that we work with is a barber shop. And the barber says, I get people in here all the time. I think he's in Pennsylvania. I get people in here all the time who have different political perspectives, and I'm cutting their hair, and we're talking it out, and that's him doing his bit. It's just for all of us figuring out where we can contribute and doing whatever we can to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great, and that's, I guess the term that I heard is like kind of choose your lane, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like an effort, and I think that there's, and I feel very grateful to Braver Angels for helping me find a lane. And again,
Mm.
there's a lot more to do, and who knows what'll happen in the future. But I know that the angry, suspicious, scared person that I was, and like January 6th to me was like
Mm.
I mean, that was a catalyst for feeling some real fear and terror, frankly, about like
Totally.
what was going to happen in our country and to my children's world. And
Yeah.
I feel so much more, I guess, hopeful, and
Mm.
resolute in that hope than I could have ever fathomed a couple of years ago. So in that respect, I'm deeply indebted to Braver
I
Angels
love
for
that.
being that kind of beacon. So
Oh,
thank
that's
you.
awesome. No, I love that. That gives me chills. That's so cool. I mean, I love that it's a jumping off point for anyone. That even if you meet one person, like with you and Eric, like you meet someone that like just can shift your mind a little bit, and it really can. This work can be life changing. Like, and I know that sounds super grandiose, but I really believe it's true. Like, and it's interesting because even the other day I was thinking about it. Sometimes people will be like, "What are the tactics? Just give me the tactics. What are the tools that I need in this conversation to, get someone to listen to me, or me to, not, get agitated or whatever." And the tools are great because the tools can be, an entry point to, kind of that evolution and stuff like that. But I think it's so much bigger than here's a tactic or here's a tip. It's like, here is, and I think David Blankenhorn puts it in this framing, that our president, it's putting on glasses and seeing the world in an entirely new light. It's not just this one thing or another thing. It's like a fundamental shift, which is, it's big, but it's, that's where we get, when we hear about stories like yours or anyone else's throughout Braver Angels, that's what makes me most excited,
Yeah.
is the fundamental shift aspect.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. We should wrap up. I have one question I wanted to ask before getting to the end, which was, as we go into the presidential election for the next year or so, and knowing that the media is not going to change fundamentally over the next year, so it is what it is. What would your advice be to me, or to anybody who hasn't really been engaged with the media, to kind of be informed but not be triggered? Like, to me, and I'll just start, what my thinking is maybe I almost wish there was a weekly news magazine again, so at least I could read things with a little bit of distance between the triggering event and not. But is the what would you say to somebody about how to be, I guess, responsibly informed about what's going on out there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So two things. So one thing, again, not to sound too woo-woo, but one thing that's helped me is meditation. And the reason that meditation has helped me, just for a variety of reasons, but after I meditate, it's almost like after a workout, you don't want to go eat a sundae because you're like, I just did this good thing for my mind or body. I don't want to pollute it with this junk. So for me, my test for good media resources is after I meditate, who am I still open to reading and listening to? Who doesn't feel like I'm polluting my mind? And so one for me is Tangle, is the newsletter Tangle, Isaac Stahl's newsletter. And it's a daily newsletter. He kind of covers often a big story. He gives the bullet points of what happened, what are the big news. He covers one story in depth. He gives what the right is saying, what the left is saying. He gives his own perspective. But to me, and I don't know Isaac, but to me, the way it comes across, it's just he's a person. He's not one of those journalists who is, everything's a 12. He's calm, he's rational, he's reasonable. You understand where he's coming from. So to me, that's been a great source, and it's passed my meditation test. Another organization that I actually just spoke to recently was Ground News, and they really tried to show people the blind spots in their news. And so that's just another way of just, in some ways it's good because you're not everything's going to be a 12, because the way that the news is formulated on their site is you see the other side automatically, right away. So I think those two resources really come to mind for me, and meditation. I'm always trying to plug meditation.
Okay, great. Cool. All right. Well, thank you. That's great. Yeah. And then to wrap up, can I ask what gives you hope at the end of the day?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, honestly, Americans give me hope. And I think, specifically people I've worked with through Braver Angels. And when I first started Braver Angels, I was doing field reporting. So I was interviewing people and hearing their stories. And I got so electrified by just talking to people and hearing about their changes. And, I would have to get up after the interview and walk around and pace around my room and just think about how exciting it was. And I think, the thing that makes me sad about the United States right now is that we're such an inherently optimistic country. And right now I feel like we're kind of in this state of self-loathing and we don't really know how to move forward. But the amazing thing is that through Braver Angels and through through so many different organizations, just by getting out there and actually talking to Americans and talking to people, you see oh my God, we are such a good country. We really are. Our people are so good. They're so smart. They want to help, and so to the point of what gives me hope, it's really just talking to people like you. It's just super, super cool. It really is the biggest privilege of my job.
That's great. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Gabby, for making time to talk and for all the work that you're doing.
Oh my God. Thank you for having me, Michael. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.